Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery video. This week we're covering a solved case, and it's the case of Yara Gambirasio, and the hunt for her killer became one of the biggest police operations ever seen in Italy. It's unlike any case I've ever read about or researched, and I've spent a lot of time getting all this information together, so I feel like it's going to be a long video, but I do just want to put a little disclaimer here at the beginning. A lot of the sources that I was looking at were all in Italian, and I don't speak Italian, so I've depended a lot on online translators, Google Translate. And so if I have got any facts wrong, then I'm really sorry, just correct me down below if it's anything major. But yeah, so I sort of have tried to get everything together as much as I can, but I don't speak Italian, although I do feel like I speak slightly better Italian than I did before this. And also as well, this is the case of a 13-year-old girl dying, so if you're sensitive to stuff like that, maybe this isn't the video for you. But I would recommend watching because it is a very interesting case. So Yara came from a very normal family. They were quite unexceptional, just very regular people, and together they lived in a town in the foothills of the Alps called Gambirasio di Sopra. So this town only had about 8,000 occupants. It was very, very small. The Gambirasio family consisted of Fulvio, an architect, Yara's dad, Yara, her mother, who was a teacher, and together they had 4 children. Yara was the second oldest. She had one older sister and then 2 younger brothers. And Yara was your typical 13-year-old, and she was obsessed with gymnastics. Gymnastics was her life. She was a rhythmic gymnast, and she basically just, her whole life revolved around going to gym classes, going to competitions. All of her friends pretty much were all gymnasts as well. It was what she loved. It was Friday the 26th of November 2010 when Yara went missing. At 5:15 p.m. she left her home to walk to the gym. It was only about a few hundred meters away, so it wasn't a long walk. So she left her home to walk to the gym, and from what I could gather, she wasn't going to the gym for a lesson. She was going to drop off a stereo, but ended up staying around for a little bit. I sort of saw a lot of conflicting sources on this, but that's mainly what I can gather. The gym she attended was a large sports building that wasn't just for gymnastics. She had her gymnastics lessons in the large sports hall, but there's also sort of courts of different sports. There was a swimming pool, there were running tracks. It was a really sort of big complex. So Yara leaves her house at 5:15, and her parents expect her home like not long later, maybe an hour, hour and a half at most. But she never returned home. So at 7:11 p.m, Yara's mum decides to call her, but it just goes straight to voicemail. 11 minutes later, Yara's dad, Fulvio, knowing that this was so unlike Yara, decides to call the police. And the police took this very, very seriously from the get-go. Within minutes, they had both the state police and the military police, the carabinieri, I think. Sorry, I'm going to butcher so many Italian words in this. They had both of them on the case. The lead magistrate put in charge of the case was a woman named Letizia Ruggeri. She'd been in the police force for over 20 years. She knew what she was doing, and she was a mother herself. She had a young daughter just like Yara, so she knew the pain that Yara's mother would be feeling in this instance, and Ruggeri leaped into action. Now, it was very clear from the offset that Yara's family had nothing to do with her disappearance. Like I said, they were just a regular, normal family. However, the police had to look into them anyway. All of their phones were wiretapped, and the police interviewed each member of the family, also like extended family, close friends, kind of interviewed everyone who knew the family. It became quite clear very quickly that the Gambirasios just didn't have anything to do with it. They were devastated over the loss of their daughter. Jerry ordered that the records of 15,000 phones get checked, both from Yara's village, Gambirasio di Sopra, and surrounding villages. And as well as the records being checked of thousands of phones, she also ordered that loads of phones be wiretapped. She said all of the sort of potential suspects, she wanted their phones wiretapped. She wanted to be able to listen into their conversations. So they ended up wiretapping hundreds of phones. Now, this was a small town. Gambirasio di Sopra, like I said, only had about 8,000 inhabitants. So things like this just didn't happen around the area. And Yara wasn't the kind of girl just to run away. She was a very typical 13-year-old. So the police immediately knew that it was something more than just a runaway child. Now, police tracked Yara's last moves and confirmed that she definitely attended the gymnasium. Some sources said that she did some light training, like I said. Some sources just say she dropped off the stereo. But regardless, she would have left the gym just after about 6 p.m. Yara's own phone records were looked into, and it showed that she sent her last text at 6:44 p.m. She was texting a friend, just organising to meet up the following Sunday. And this is quite a big thing in this case because it proves that Yara had no intent to disappear. Because she was making plans for the following Sunday with a friend, totally unsuspecting of anything happening to her. This to the police was major proof at this point that she had been taken. So that was at 6:44 p.m. that she texted her friend. However, just under half an hour later, at 7:11 p.m. when her mother called her, her phone was off and it went straight to voicemail. Something had happened to her in under half an hour. The last signals in Yara's phone come from a small hamlet not far from Brabate in a town called Mapello, and these came at 6:49 p.m. Now I've looked up on Google Maps and it's about an 8-minute drive away. Now this to me is a little bit strange, because if somebody had abducted her and driven her the 8 minutes to Mapello, she would have texted her friend making these plans while she was in the car with this person, unless of course the text had like a delayed send, or maybe somebody grabbed her as she was writing this text. Tracker dogs were of course brought in to help with the investigation. They had 3 separate tracker dogs that they used on 3 different occasions, and each dog led them to the same place. Each dog led them to Mapello. Now Mapello wasn't like en route to her home. Her home was in one direction and Mapello was in the complete opposite direction. So it didn't even look like Yara had even attempted to start walking home yet. She had just been abducted from straight outside the gym. Now Yara's parents were very quiet and reserved people, and they did not deal well with the media suddenly coming into their lives. And there was a lot of media because this case really caught Italy's attention. A beautiful 13-year-old girl going missing was just kind of unheard of in the region that she lived in. But shortly after Yara disappeared, her parents did a press announcement. They basically went on TV and begged for whoever had their daughter to let her go. They said just to open the door, open the gate and just let her walk away, and that they wouldn't do anything, they wouldn't come after them. All they wanted was their daughter home and safe. They also shared photos in the press of Yara, hoping to get her face out there. Anyone who had seen her, they wanted to come forward no matter how brief the sighting was, but nothing really came of it. There wasn't any huge leads to come from this. A couple of weeks after Yara disappeared, the police think they come across their first big lead. They've wiretapped the phone of a man called Mohammed Fikri, and in this phone call they think they overhear something. Mohammed was Moroccan. In the phone call he wasn't speaking Italian, so his phone call had to be translated. And the translator said they heard the following words. He said that Mohammed said, "Forgive me God, I didn't kill her." Now Fikri was a builder in Mapello at the time, and to the investigators this was a huge deal. Your last signals on Yara's phone had been in Mapello, and Fikri worked in Mapello, and for them it just all added up. So they immediately go to arrest him. However, by the time they've leaped into action, he's already on a boat. He's going to Tangiers. The police intercept the boat and arrest him straight away. It isn't helped by the fact that when the police got hold of Fikri's van, in the back they found a mattress that was blood-stained. Now people really liked Fikri as the guilty party here. He was a foreigner, he wasn't Italian, therefore they really clung on to the fact that he was the one that killed Yara. Of course he was. However, it didn't take very long for it to come out that Fikri had nothing to do with Yara's death. The blood on the mattress in his van wasn't Yara's. They never said who it was, but the fact they didn't find it suspicious leads me to believe that it was Fikri's own blood. And also they found out that the call had been completely mistranslated. He did not say what they said he said. So despite the Italian outrage, Fikri was released. He had nothing to do with the murder. But people are still really angry at Ruggiero for making the choice to let Fikri go. I mean, even though looking back on it we can say that it's very obvious he had nothing to do with it, people were fuming. People just wanted to have somebody to pin this on. I don't think they cared whether or not he actually did it. So they're back to square one, and then it's 3 months to the day after Yara's disappearance. It's the 26th of February 2011. A man from a village called Chignolo called Ilario Scotti was flying his new remote controlled airplane in an overgrown field. The plane begins to malfunction, so Scotti lands the plane amongst the tall grass, and then he goes to retrieve it. And when he's retrieving it, he sort of sees all these rags lying on the floor, doesn't really think much of it. People obviously fly tipped a lot in that field. It was only when he saw some shoes that he really started to freak out, and he realised that he was looking at the body of a young girl. He of course immediately calls the authorities, who come straight away, and Scotti actually doesn't move from the spot. He starts to walk away and then turns around and sees that he can't see the body anymore. He's scared of losing the body, so he just walks back and stays put, so when the police arrive they can easily find it, because this is so overgrown. And the police did actually search this field when Yara first went missing, but it was so overgrown it was really difficult to see things. So Scotty just stayed put until the authorities arrived. Ruggieri arrived shortly after. When Ruggieri arrived, she said that she kind of knew immediately that it was the body of Yara that she was looking at, because she was wearing the same clothes that Yara was when she went missing, some leggings and a black bomber jacket. The body was in a really advanced stage of decomposition. It had been sort of like raining, it had been freezing. These were the winter months in the bottom of the Alps, so it got pretty cold. So Yara had been freezing, unfreezing over and over again, so she was really decomposed. At the scene, investigators also found Yara's iPod and her house keys, but they also found parts of her phone. They found her phone battery and the SIM card, but her actual phone has been missing ever since. Yara's autopsy took 2 days, and they actually put her body in a CAT scanner so they could get a full 3D view of what had happened to her body. Yara hadn't been raped or sexually assaulted in any way, but her bra had been unhooked, which led the investigators to believe that this possibly was a motive of whoever took her, but possibly Yara fought back and made it hard for them to do so. She had multiple knife slashes across her body, 9 or 10 wounds. She had wounds across the bottom of her back, both of her wrists and the bottom of her neck. Also across her chest as well. On her head, on the front of her head, she had 3 kind of major wounds, and on the back she had a very serious wound, and the facial wounds were said to be caused by some sort of blunt object. But none of these wounds were actually the cause of her death. Yara lived through all of that. The cause of her death was actually hypothermia because of exposure. Basically, whoever had harmed Yara had just dumped her in the field and left her there to die. And they said that she died around midnight that night. Now, a lot of people do speculate that Yara was placed in the field later after her death, but the autopsy showed that Yara had like clumps of grass in her hand, and the grass was from the field in which she had died. So basically when she was lying there, she was probably clutching at the grass, pulling it out, and that's what they found in her hand. So that is kind of confirmation for them that she did die in the field and she wasn't dumped there later. They also found traces of lime and metal on Yara, and this led the investigators to believe that whoever harmed her had worked in the building trade. Now this is where the investigation can really begin. On Yara's underwear, they actually find a tiny piece of DNA that didn't belong to Yara. They named the suspect Ignacio Uno, unknown male 1. Through the tiny piece of DNA left on Yara's underwear, the police could discover 1 or 2 things about the killer already. Through his DNA, they could tell that he had a 94.5% chance of having very, very light blue or green eyes. You know those people you meet who just have like really piercing blue eyes? They knew that it was very likely that their killer would have that. And they also saw that he was genetically linked to the area in which they found the DNA, in which they found Yara, in the foothills of the Alps. So it was very likely that he still lived in that area now, and he had strong family links to the surrounding villages. Now in Italy, they don't have a national DNA database like we do in the UK over here. Obviously we don't have everyone's DNA in a database, but there is a database with a lot of people's DNA in it. They don't have that in Italy, so they kind of had to start from square one. And so they start to take DNA. They start with Yara's family, her extended family, then her friends' parents. They start with all of her classmates, and then her classmates' parents, and then their friends. All of her gymnastics friends, her coaches, all of their relatives, anyone who ever set foot in the sports complex, they took their DNA. They basically wanted to take a sample of everyone's DNA that they could, and not only those directly linked to Yara, they wanted everyone's. They knew that the killer still had to live in the area, so they thought sooner or later they'd hit the jackpot. And not only did they think by doing this that eventually they might reach the killer, they thought it could scare some people as well, and maybe a confession might come forward. Now, although Yara's town itself was very small, the area that it was in was kind of like the Bergamo area. And Bergamo is a big city in Italy, and the population of this just sort of general area was about 1 million. The police knew that if they could sample about 15 to 20,000 people's DNA in this area through familial genetics, they would have the DNA of pretty much everyone. And it was at this point that they decided to stop focusing on the individual's DNA. They were no longer looking for an individual match. They started to focus on the Y chromosome. Now I'm going to explain this to you in very layman's terms, of sort of piecing together what I've read on the internet that I could understand and my knowledge of GCSE biology here. but the Y chromosome is basically passed down through the paternal bloodline, and it remains virtually unchanged from father to son, meaning that a great-great-great-grandfather could have exactly the same Y chromosome sort of genetics as their great-great-great-grandson. I mean, it can go back even further than that. For generations and generations, all of these men will have the same chromosome. It also means that you can be matched to distantly related cousins that you never even knew existed. They basically took the Y chromosome from unknown male 1 and they were trying to match it to anyone who had the same Y chromosome. In October 2011, they finally found somebody with the Y chromosome that they were looking for. The man was called Damiano Gerononi, and it became very clear to investigators that Damiano wasn't the man they were looking for. His actual full DNA wasn't a complete match for unknown male 1, and he was also in South America volunteering at the time of Yara's disappearance. But they knew that Damiano had to be related. They didn't know if it could have been a brother or a 6th cousin 3 times removed, for example. It was a step closer, but only a baby step. And they start to question Damiano's family. Now, Damiano's dad had died years before, so they talked to his mum and they discovered something shocking about his mother. His mother was a woman named Aurora Zani, and Aurora was the Gambirasio's housemaid for years and years. She had known Yara growing up. This was finally the link that the police had been looking for. Now, Aurora was absolutely devastated to be linked to Yara's disappearance in this way. She loved Yara. She basically watched her grow up and she was devastated to be linked to her death. So Damiano and Aurora's calls were wiretapped, so also the rest of the family as well, and the police listened closely. But none of them gave anything away whatsoever. They kept getting called in for DNA, but they weren't ever acting suspicious. All they'd say is like, oh yeah, I've been called to give my DNA. And that's it. It sort of became once again clear that they had nothing to do with it. The close link to Yara's family was put down to a coincidence, and honestly, in such a small community anyway, it was bound to happen. But although Damiano and his mother had nothing to do with it, it didn't change the fact that he was definitely related to the person that did. So Ruggeri's team spend months and months recreating the Gerononi family tree. They go back generations. They go back to sort of the mid-1800s. They discover that the majority of the Gerononi family resides in a town called Gorno. Gorno was about 45 to 50 kilometers away from Brimbati di Sopra. It wasn't exactly close, but the Gerononi family was a big family in this town. So the authorities go to Gorno and they start testing DNA again. But this time they weren't just going in testing random people's DNA, they were focusing on people with the surname Gerononi. And everyone in the town was sort of baffled. They had no idea why the police were here, suddenly taking all of their DNA. It was a very, very small little, I keep calling it a town, it was more of a village, maybe even like a hamlet. So they come across the DNA of a man called Pierpaolo Gerononi. Now, Pierpaolo was Damiano's cousin, and his DNA was even closer to that of unknown male 1. It proved that he was a 50% match. The authorities knew they were getting closer. From what they could tell at this point, Pierpaolo was the brother of unknown male 1. Pierpaolo only had one brother, and his brother was a drug addict who also did not match the DNA entirely. So as they're following this Y chromosome, they decide to look into Pierpaolo's father, Giuseppe Gerononi. Now, Giuseppe was never a suspect because he actually died in 1999, so there's no way he is the one who killed Yara. The authorities questioned Giuseppe's widow, a woman called Laura, and Laura knew nothing of any other affairs, any other children. The only children that she knew Giuseppe had were their 3. They had 2 sons and 1 daughter. So at this point, the authorities need the DNA of Giuseppe because they need to confirm their hunches even further. So they asked the family to sort of give them any personal items of Giuseppe that could still contain his DNA. Now, this was a solid 12 years after his death, so I wouldn't have been surprised if they managed to find nothing. But they get lucky. Gerononi family happily hand over some of Giuseppe's personal items. I mean, they know that none of them killed Yara, so what have they got to be concerned about? They hand over some items, including a postcard that Giuseppe sent to his daughter and a driving license. Now, the driving licenses in those days had to have a stamp sort of licked and put onto it to sort of verify the license. So experts managed to extract Giuseppe's DNA from these stamps. Through this, they had Giuseppe's genetic profile and they could confirm that he had the same DNA on all markers to unknown male 1. They confirmed that without a doubt, Giuseppe was the father. Now, just to double check as well, they did exhume Giuseppe's body at this point and they took his actual DNA, and again it confirmed their suspicions. It was definitely Giuseppe's DNA they had before, and he was definitely the father. Can you imagine being the Gambirasio family at this point? You've known someone for so long and you suddenly realise that they were keeping secrets from you before their death, and you actually have a sibling that you don't know about. It kind of was a massive bombshell on the Gambirasio family. Investigators came to the only conclusion that they could. Giuseppe was unfaithful and he had another son with a different woman. But this was all they had. At this point it was another dead end because they still had no idea who this was. This could have been anyone. Now, when he was alive, Giuseppe Gambirasio was your standard family man. He married at a young age, he had 3 children, they were very happy together. He never showed any signs of ever having an affair. But he was the local bus driver, and every single morning he would pick up women from all over the village and surrounding villages and drop them to their jobs at the local textiles factories. So he came into contact with a lot of young women. Investigators spoke to all of Giuseppe's old colleagues, and a lot of them said that Giuseppe was definitely a ladies' man. One of them described him as a man with a capital M. What I could gather, a lot of them kind of did admit to knowing that Giuseppe had had affairs. Now, no one really wanted to come forward with the gory details, shall we say. Gorno was a small religious town and nobody wanted to sort of bring up any old gossip. An affair and an illegitimate son would cause a scandal. So now the investigators had to find an unknown woman. It was like finding a needle in a haystack. So again, they start testing for DNA, and instead of just going for the Gambirasios, they start to test women. And everyone was very confused as to why they were testing the DNA, even of elderly women. But the authorities knew they were looking for a middle-aged to old-age woman who had children. She would have had an affair 30 to 40 years ago and given birth to a baby boy, but it's probably hidden behind the curtains of marriage. This was a massive dead end in the case because the authorities knew that even if they kept testing DNA of people in Gorno, the woman could easily have moved away, or she could have even have died in this time. They had no idea who she was. And in late 2013, the investigation really starts to come to an end and the authorities make a decision that they're gonna have to close the case. However, Ruggieri was a strong woman and she promised Yara's mum that she would find the killer, and that is what she was going to do. So Ruggieri turns to 2 final people. She turns to 2 DNA experts at the University of Pavia, and these 2 experts are the ones who managed to close this case. They looked right into the genes of unknown male 1 and found this sort of rare genetic mutation that they called allele 26. So they compared this DNA with the DNA of Giuseppe Gambirasio, and they discovered that Giuseppe didn't have this rare mutation, so it had to have come from the mother. Now, investigators had narrowed down the possible mothers to one of about 532, I think, people. That was a lot of DNA samples for these analysts to go through, but they started and they did not give up until they found their match. They were basically going through this DNA looking for that rare mutation, that allele 26, and even if they had found this allele in more than one person, it doesn't mean they're a match, it just means that they have this same mutation, but they knew that that would be one step closer. So they kept going until they reached woman 321. This woman's name was Esther Azufi. Esther also had allele 26, and so they put her DNA up against that of unknown male 1, and on each marker it hit a match. This was without a doubt the mother. They called Ruggieri to let her know, and she immediately alerted the Carabinieri. They looked a little further into Esther and they discovered that she had lived on the same street with her husband as Giuseppe and his wife. This was finally the link that they'd been looking for. Now, they'd had Esther's DNA since 2012, so what had taken them so long to make this match? This should have been immediate. They should have had this the year before. Turns out that originally all of the female DNA went to a lab in Rome, and the analyst in Rome had made a big mistake and they hadn't checked the DNA up against that of unknown male 1. They checked the DNA up against Yara's, so of course nothing would make a match. Investigators discovered that Esther had 3 children. She'd had a set of twins, a male and a female, and then another son. She gave birth to the twins in August of 1970, and the police knew that this was the kind of timeline they were looking at. It was very likely that the male twin was unknown male 1. This man was 42 years old. He was a builder and lived in Mapello with his wife and 3 children. He was called Massimo Bassetti. Now, Ruggeri knew that she had to act fast here, but she couldn't afford for there to be any more mistakes in this case. So she orders the authorities to start following Bassetti. She wanted to figure out what his daily routine was, who he hung out with, what he did. She wanted to know every aspect of his life. And a few days later, the police set up a roadblock, and they pretended that the roadblock was to test for drink driving. And they knew that Massimo would be coming along this road sooner or later, and of course, eventually he did. So he's in his car with his wife and his children, and he gets pulled over. Now, he's laughing with his wife because he knows that he hasn't been drinking. So they do a breathalyzer test, and the police officer pretends that the breathalyzer didn't work the first time. So he carefully takes off the nib and puts it into a bag and then replaces it and asks Massimo to try again. So Massimo's still laughing, happy to do it, does it again. And then the police officer says, yeah, that's fine, you can go. So he lets him go. The police officer runs the DNA samples to the higher ups, who then immediately transfer it to a lab to get tested. And this is when they can confirm for 100% certainty that unknown male 1 was Massimo Bassetti. And this is where Ruggeri gives the green light for Massimo Bassetti to be arrested. She orders the Carabinieri to follow him to work, and they do. They follow him. He parks up and he starts climbing up to the top of the roof. He was a builder, so he was working on a building site. The Carabinieri go towards the building and they sort of cover all exits. Massimo sees them, panics and starts to run. Now he starts to climb down, but eventually he gets caught, and he's sort of just like, he basically lets himself get caught. He's on the ground, they put him in handcuffs. At this point he looks confused as to why he's being arrested, but when he's first seen the Carabinieri coming for him, he's run, he's scared, he knows why they're there for him. Now, Massimo Bassetti is not what you would expect from a killer. He doesn't look like a murderer. He's small and weedy, and he doesn't really look like he could overpower anyone, but he's got these piercing blue eyes. He was arrested on June 16th, 2014, and he was taken to jail where he was immediately given a public defender. The announcement of his arrest meant that Italy finally breathed a sigh of relief. They had been so involved in catching the murderer of Yara Gambirasio. However, Massimo and his family maintain his innocence to this day. They say that there's no way the Massimo they know killed Yara. His mother Esther has always denied having any affairs whatsoever. She is married to a man called Giovanni Bassetti, and she says that all 3 of her children are Giovanni's. But the DNA doesn't lie, and the twins are 100% the children of Giuseppe Garanoni. Further tests also proved that her youngest child, Fabio, was also not the child of Giovanni. She had had another affair as well, but she still denies having any affairs at all. Massimo found out that the father who had raised him was not his biological father the same day that everyone else did. He had no idea. The trial started in 2016, and on the 1st of July 2016, Massimo was sentenced to life in prison after being found guilty of the murder of Yara Gambirasio. The prosecution had a lot of circumstantial evidence to work with, the main one being the DNA on Yara's underwear, and no matter how much the defence argued, you can't really fight the fact that his DNA was found there. How else would it get there? But they also pointed out that Massimo frequently hung out in the areas in which Yara did. He sort of went to pizzerias down the road, he was always hanging around the gymnasium, he was just in that area a lot. And although this isn't anything major, I mean, a lot of people hang around in a lot of areas in which people go missing from, I'm sure, it was just another thing to add. He had troubling internet search history which implied a compulsion, a proclivity for younger girls. And most importantly, his phone records showed that he had been in Barbati di Sopra the night that Yara disappeared. He had turned off his phone at 5:45 p.m. and didn't turn it on until 7:34 a.m. the next morning, which was unlike him. They also found fibres on the back of Yara's leggings which matched the fibres found in Massimo's van. Now, of course, police did a huge search of Massimo's van, but they couldn't find any actual DNA of Yara's or any blood in there. But you've got to remember that by the point Massimo was arrested, it was years later. He would have had multiple chances to clean the van out. Now, the defence argued against each point, and even now there are people who are 100% convinced that Massimo's innocent and that he was set up. The defence argued that they never found the murder weapon, they never found any DNA on Massimo or in his van. There was never any solid evidence that placed Massimo as killing Yara. It was all just circumstantial stuff. They argued that the DNA that the prosecution had wasn't really admissible because it was only nuclear DNA and there was a complete absence of any mitochondrial DNA. Now, I don't know really how it works, but from what I've read, you can't really have that. You can't have nuclear without the mitochondrial. The defence argued that because of this, there was room for error in finding who this DNA belonged to. They said the DNA on Yara's underwear does not prove that he killed her. It just proves that he was present and not responsible. The defence also focused on Yara's gymnastics coach, a woman called Sylvia Brenner. Apparently, the DNA analyst found an abundant amount of Sylvia's DNA on the jacket of Yara's coat. And apparently, Sylvia hadn't seen Yara that day, and for there to be that amount of DNA when she hadn't even been with her that day was apparently unusual. The defence also argued that the night that Yara disappeared, Sylvia spent all night crying. She was absolutely crying her eyes out, and her father and brother had no idea why, and at this time Sylvia wouldn't have known about the disappearance of Yara. They really just tried to pin it on Sylvia rather than Massimo, but the police did look into Sylvia at the time, but she was completely cleared. Massimo does remain his innocence, but he will likely spend the rest of his life in jail for the murder of Yara Gambirasio. He appealed in July of 2017, just last year, but the verdict was upheld and he will remain in jail. The Gambirasio family have always remained private and out of the spotlight, but they did sort of start a gymnastics trophy in Yara's name, which they presented at a competition shortly after Yara's death. Yara was buried in a white coffin between her two grandparents, and on her gravestone there's no date of death, it's just a picture of her and her name. Ruggieri made a promise to Yara's parents that she would find the man that did this no matter how long it took, and despite being faced with so much adversity and so much criticism, Ruggieri managed to uphold her promise and found Massimo Bossetti. This is such an interesting case, and I think it's very refreshing once in a while to hear about a case which has a fulfilled ending. I'll never say a happy ending because you can never be happy about the murder of a 13-year-old girl, but at least her parents now have peace knowing that the man that did it will be behind bars the rest of his life. If you enjoyed this video, as always, make sure you give it a thumbs up and leave all your comments down below, and make sure you subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in my next video. Bye guys.